Lady Justice is a true crime podcast, therefore deals with incidents of violence, disturbing imagery and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised. The Lady Justice podcast wishes to offer their deepest condolences to the victims' families and wishes to offer thanks to those that work in emergency services. Hello my lovelies, and welcome to another episode of Lady Justice, a true crime podcast. Lady Justice is a weekly podcast that covers fascinating cases, both past and present. My name is Chantel, and I'm your friendly true crime addict with slight caffeine addiction issues. I hope everybody is doing incredibly well and enjoying a brilliant week. As usual, before I get into this week's episode, I just want to ask you guys a massive favour. Please support this podcast by subscribing, rating and leaving a review where you can. And because sharing is caring, I do want you to tell everyone you know, share it on social media and get the word out. It would make the world of difference. And if you'd like to contact me about anything, please feel free to do so via social media or my email, which you'll find in the show notes. Last week, Adam over at the UK True Crime Podcast was kind enough to publish an article I wrote on his blog entitled How True Crime Helped Me Survive. So if you get the chance, head over and give it a read. The link is included in the show notes. When John Perry decided to kill his wife, he went through drastic means to dispose of her body, from consulting an ex-butcher on the best way to dismember a body, baking her head in the family oven, to feeding what he could to his beloved Katie the cat. This is the case of Arminda Ventura Perry. So, without further ado, here is some background on the location and time frame of this crime. We are heading to the tiny, rural and unassuming village of Higher Kinnerton in North Wales, close to the English border. It's just a normal village with a village hall, a primary school, a little shop and 2 pubs. This case takes place in 1991, an incredibly important year for the UK, as after a high-profile court case, the British government clearly defined the difference between a cake and a biscuit and decided that the famous Jaffa is most definitely a cake. As always, all my sources will be listed in the show notes. So let's get on it like a car bonnet. Arminda Ventura Perry, known by friends as Annabelle, was born in 1964 in the Philippines. A pretty young woman, she worked in a local tourist hotspot as a barmaid. She was a happy, vivacious, hard-working young mother to a beautiful daughter. She had a close circle of family and friends, and she was loved. In 1984, she met John Frederick Perry, a British tourist, whilst she was serving at the bar. He was much older at 45, but they spoke throughout the night and began to form a connection. He was on holiday after a nasty divorce and was totally besotted by the attractive, dark-haired beauty that had appeared to take a shine to him too. John frequented the bar that Arminda worked at as often as he could whilst on holiday, and just before he was to head home, he went to say goodbye. They talked for a while before Arminda admitted she'd miss him when he left and wished they had more time. During their heartfelt conversation, John decided to do something he had not planned on when he booked the holiday at the travel agents earlier that year. He then proposed to a girl he barely knew at a bar in a foreign land. They decided that Arminda should come back to the UK with John. They would wed and they would start their adventure together with no regrets. And this is exactly what happened. Arminda said her goodbyes to her loved ones and arrived at her new home in a bungalow in the sleepy village in North Wales. It was a very different life for the 20-year-old. Making the most of it, she took part-time work, made friends, and settled into a marriage with her new loving husband. For the first 2 years of their marriage, everything was picture perfect, at least from the outside, but there were issues brewing. John's temper became shorter, and he would take out his aggression on his wife, initially through name-calling and increasingly silly demands, before he would begin to use a more physical method. John had decided that his new wife didn't actually love him, but was married to him because she wanted to escape. John had decided that his new wife didn't love him, but was married to him because she wanted to escape her previous life in the Philippines. His views on women were, shall we say, rather cavemanish, and it's something we're going to delve into a little later in the episode. He often worked the night shift in his job as an aircraft engineer, and started to accuse Arminda of inviting men into their marital bed whilst he was away. The abuse began to increase in frequency, and at some point in their 7-year relationship, Arminda, in the end, after all the accusations, did take comfort in other men. I'm not saying that it was the right thing to do, but you can see how it was understandable. She was young, unhappy, and vulnerable. Her husband was not what he had seemed when drinking in the bar the week that they had met. He wasn't the kind man who had just been taken advantage of by his ex-wife. Their relationship was coming to an end, and they both knew it. However, only one knew how it would end for good. Arminda started to spend a few nights apart from her husband, sometimes running in fear to trusted friends, and sometimes to men that she had met. Anything really, so she didn't have to stay at home. That was until the cold February of 1991, when she disappeared for a little longer than usual. A neighbour of the Perry couple started to feel uneasy that she had not seen her friend Arminda for a fortnight. She was well aware that the neighbour would often spend a few days away from the bungalow on Myrtle Avenue. However, something just did not sit right. John hadn't mentioned anything in passing when they had seen each other, so she decided that she would contact the police to report the 27-year-old missing. North Wales Police did, in fact, take notice of the report and went to visit the neighbour to take some information on February 28, 1991. There hadn't been any reports of a disturbance in the weeks previous, and although the neighbour did take into account the fact that Arminda would sometimes leave for a few days, here and there, she would always keep in contact with her friends. The concerned neighbour and friend also told police of the conversations with Arminda about the frustrations in her marriage and the fact that she had begun divorce proceedings. After the short interview, 2 officers took themselves to knock on John and Arminda's door. An overweight and tired-looking man answered the door and was taken aback by the sight of the police. Asking what it was concerning, he tried to wedge himself between the door and the officers, but instantly finding John's behaviour suspicious, they requested a talk inside the home. Questioned on why he had yet to report his wife missing, John claimed that he didn't believe her to be, telling police that it was usual for his much younger wife to run off with other men and to return when she was bored or needed some money. He claimed that she worked as a sex worker, he knew about it, and he could not stop her, as she enjoyed it. Taken aback by his frank words, police questioned him further on if he knew the man that she'd been with, but John claimed that he did not know. He then tried to console the police worries by telling them that they were wasting their time and should be back at some point. Not satisfied, the 2 officers asked if they could take a quick look around the small home, checking for any clue in Arminda's possessions that could lead them to find her, to check on the wife's welfare. John was asked if Arminda kept a diary. This was the time before almost all of our personal information was kept on our phones in our pockets. John said that she did not keep one, but reluctantly agreed that they could take a look around. The home was clean and tidy, but as the 2 officers made their way towards the kitchen, they detected an odd smell. A mix of bleach, cooked meat, and rotting meat. This wasn't the kind of smell that if you had some chicken breast that had gone off in the fridge because you'd forgotten about it. It was strong, almost overbearing. Inspector Ross Duffield was later to say, "I was struck by a pungent smell somewhere near. The smell of cooked meat. It was so pungent I could almost taste it. As they entered the kitchen, they saw a small tabby cat dart across the floor towards 2 bin bags that were close to the back door that led out towards the garage. As John called for his cat to move away from the bags, the cat did as most cats do, act as ignorantly as possible and carried on. Katie, as the cat was called, rummaged into the top of one of the bags and dragged out a piece of red meat. Snarling as she brought it to the floor, she began to chew. John, not knowing what to do, began to apologise and make excuses. The bag was filled with some meat that he'd received off a butcher as he tried to shoo the feline away. The police, though, they weren't buying it. Looking around, they spotted 2 items in the kitchen, close to the sink, that were most definitely odd. They were not your usual utensils. They were a blood-stained hacksaw and a screwdriver laid out on the counter close to an open book. The police asked John about the tools in the kitchen before taking a closer look at the book. A medical encyclopedia was opened on a page featuring the human skeleton, and there were bloody fingerprints on it. Knowing the police had instantly made the connection between the tools, bags on the floor, the smell of the home, and his missing wife, John gave up the act and admitted to killing his wife. John was arrested there and then, and forensics were called in. The small bungalow was now a crime scene. On further examination, police found 2 large wine fermenting bins in the garage that contained more meat. Detectives at the scene noted how some of it had been burnt, others cooked, but much of it raw. One of the other bins also contained human organs. The investigation revealed that Arminda had filed for divorce, stating his abuse as the reason. The courts had accepted the filing and ordered John Perry to pay a £15,000 settlement and a weekly spousal maintenance of £52.67. Perry claimed that he did not intend to kill his wife. In fact, he stated he did not even remember doing so. He claimed that on the day that he killed her, they had been arguing about their upcoming divorce, and Arminda was beside herself, not wanting the relationship to end. She had hold of a kitchen knife while stood in the lounge of the property, waving the blade around and threatening to commit suicide unless he agreed they could stay together. The row became heated, and as he tried desperately, as he claimed, to stop his wife from hurting herself, she became violent, punching him while screaming. John then claimed to black out. The last thing he remembered doing was hitting Arminda with some force in the face with a closed fist in a bid to stop the chaos. Then he found his wife dead and believed that no one would believe the fact that he did not mean to kill his wife. The temporary amnesia had worn off and he panicked, so he came up with a plan to dispose of the body, leaving as little evidence as possible. He spoke openly with police during the investigation and told them of how he spoke to a friend of his that used to work as a butcher. Not telling the friend that he was, of course, wanting to butcher his wife, he asked how one would cut up a carcass of a pig. He found that he must try to drain the body of as much blood as possible. He attempted this and told detectives of how he gathered the blood in the bathtub and then collect it in 20-gallon buckets and drive around the countryside, dumping the buckets along the road. Questions were asked about some of the body parts that were missing. Perry then admitted that he took the brain from the skull and removed the eyes, placing them in a box and burying them in a shallow grave in a nearby forest. He told police that it was not to hide her identity, but to make his plan of disposal easier. He also claimed to have dumped other small body parts from his helpless victim in fields, forests and ditches in the nearby country. Unsurprisingly, he was charged with the murder of his wife, and he was held on remand until his trial was set for later the same year. The trial of John Frederick Perry began at Mould Crown Court during November of 1991. It was a short trial lasting only 7 days, mainly due to John admitting that he had killed his wife. However, he claimed to have diminished responsibility, offering to the court that he'd only committed the offence of manslaughter. Up until October 4th, 2010, there was a section of UK law which mitigated charges of murder. It was known as the Provocation Law, which stated in the now repealed Section 3 of the Homicide Act 1957, where on a charge of murder there is evidence on which a jury can find that the person charged was provoked, whether by things done or things said or by both together, to lose his self-control, the question whether the provocation was enough to make a reasonable man do as he shall be left to be determined by the jury. And in determining the question, the jury shall take into account everything both done and said according to the effect which it would have on a reasonable man. Basically, if push came to shove and you were provoked enough to kill, you would be convicted of manslaughter. Though still a custodial sentence would be passed, it would be significantly less than that of murder. So what did John Perry claim that had provoked him so much that he would kill his wife? He claimed that his wife slept around so much that he just had to kill her, and that was his defence as he stepped into court overseen by Mr. Justice Scott Baker. Forensic evidence produced to the jury proved a damning case. The Home Office pathologist, Dr. Donald Wade, testified to the court how he collected the remains of Arminda's body and painstakingly tried to piece her body back together. From the reconstructed skull, he was able to determine that the most likely cause of death was a blunt force injury to the back of the head. The luminal test revealed that John's initial confession to police was false. Although blood was found in the living room of the property, Arminda had actually been killed in the bath, most likely not knowing what John had planned for her. Dr. Wade also testified in front of the jury that when he tried to reassemble Arminda's body, he found significant portions of the body missing and believed that the family cat was fed pieces by John in an attempt to dispose of the body quickly. The motive of money, the fact that John was due to pay his wife the first maintenance payment that week, was put forward by the prosecution, led by Alex Carlisle QC. Something that held some weight when considering Perry, his thoughts on women, and his previous relationship history. The 52-year-old, as he was when he was tried for murder, claimed that women were inferior. He told the jury that when he had met Arminda in the Philippines, he had grown sick of Western women, their assertiveness and their independence, because clearly they are rights to be earned and not freedoms of just being human. He was an abuser that ticked all the classic boxes. He liked the control he held over women. His two previous ex-wives testified on the 6th day of the trial, listing the abuse they received from the man they had married. His first wife Julia tearfully told of the beatings she had endured at the hands of Perry, including up until the 8th month of her pregnancy. She told of how she was so affected by her time married to John that she had tried to kill herself and ended up taking a restraining order out against her ex-husband in a bid for her own freedom. His second wife Susan, who he was married to in Essex in 1973, the woman he had just divorced when he went on holiday and met Arminda, told of how the abuse began 6 months into their marriage. They had spent the first 2 years of their marriage in France, as John worked on a contract as an engineer, and she felt that she had no escape. When she did finally get the chance to make it out, she told of how he threatened her constantly throughout the divorce and spoke of how his temper could not be controlled. John took the stand on the 5th day and readily admitted that he must have killed his wife, but stated it was an act that he had no control over. He said to the jury, "We were both standing up and she was slashing at me with the knife, and I hit her somewhere in the face with my fist. Then it all became rather blank." He stated that she had been continuously promiscuous. When in pubs, she would tell men that she was wearing no knickers, and if she found a man that was attracted to her, she would just stick her hands down his trousers. If John ever objected to his wife's behaviour, he was left helpless by her answer. He needed to calm down, and she was just having a bit of fun. He then went into gruesome detail about how he had called his butcher friend for tips and how he pored over the pages of the human anatomy to make the work easier. He was open about the fact he had carelessly tossed Arminda's body parts out of the car window when driving. He didn't choke up on his words as he described how he used a drill and a saw to chop through the bones of his victim. He didn't waver as he spoke about placing his wife's decapitated and hollowed out head in a dish and placing it in the oven in a bid to evaporate any moisture to make disposal easier. He didn't blink as he described the smell of human flesh being almost like pork when cooking. He felt no guilt at feeding his cat slices of flesh. The prosecution, during cross-examination, made a point how he claimed manslaughter for the fact that he had blacked out during the actual murder, and the fact that his wife wanting to be free of him drove John to do it, was at odds when taking into account the vivid descriptions that he had of how he went to dispose of Arminda. The prosecution showed evidence of how the remnants of blood were found around the entire home, including walls, floors and furniture. Edwin Bamforth, John Perry's defence solicitor, had very little to work with, but brought forward 2 witnesses to testify how the actions of Arminda had broken the man standing in the dock. On November 25th, during the trial, David Allen, a friend of the couple, stated to the jury how he believed that Arminda was using John and was openly morally loose in front of John in a bid to hurt him. He spoke of a time they were at a party in the months before the murder that the couple were attending. She was seen to be dancing with a much younger man who began to caress her in a manner that was considered by the witness as a bit full on. John was seen to be upset about this and, trying to protect his wife's good name, got into a fight with another man at the party who began to make comments about her. David told of a conversation he had with Perry that evening. "I said to him, 'I don't know how you put up with her,' and John told me, 'I know, but I love her.'" Another witness that came to prove how much Perry loved his wife and his actions were warranted was a friend, Susan Ann Coyle. She knew Arminda well and knew how much John loved his pretty wife. She described how, at another party that they had attended, Arminda was drinking heavily and dancing with a few different men. She then lifted her top to expose her bare breasts. Later the same evening, they continued on to a nightclub, and Susan saw Arminda was dancing with some other young people. Remember that Arminda was just 27, and Susan said the group were groping one another. These, along with John stating his wife was a sex worker and loved it so much that she couldn't give it up, as he put it, was the only evidence that John Perry could put forward to defend his actions. On the 7th and last day of the trial, the 26th of November 1991, the judge summed up for the jury and reiterated the law of the time being the provocation law that was integral to John Perry's defence. The jury deliberated for 5¼ hours and came back with a verdict of guilty. However, what the most concerning thing I find about this case was that the jury stood at 10-2. 2 members of the jury that heard this case believed that Arminda had driven her husband to kill her, chop her up, cook and feed her to the cat. 2 members of the jury believed that John Perry was justified in his actions. Perry was found guilty nonetheless and sentenced to life imprisonment. After the trial, there were a number of complaints from neighbours of the horror house. Residents were worried that the home may become some kind of morbid museum or shrine. There were requests to the local council that the house should be demolished in the days after. John's solicitor, Edwin Bamforth, was questioned by journalists to what would become of the house due to the fact that John was still the legal owner. He stated to the press that he was yet to consult with his client. However, if the house was to be sold, he could ensure the home was completely hygienic. The wallpaper and paint had been stripped. The home had been cleaned since the gruesome murder, so that's all good. Top fucking notch. John's first wife Julia, with whom he had a daughter Deborah, was interviewed by the Liverpool Echo. She told of her guilt in not being able to warn Arminda of the risks of being with John. She claimed that she had wished she had the courage to warn her and that Arminda was a lamb to the slaughter. Now, there is very little information about Arminda, and the press coverage was very much the same as it had been for the victim in my second episode, Julie Hogg. The court case that surrounds her case also took place in 1991, and both women were painted as promiscuous and almost deserving of their fate. Details of their sex lives were pasted all over the covers of tabloids, whilst the men that killed them had very little exposed about them. But sex sells though, right? There is still a very long way to go when we look into how society views women and their relationship with sex. Unfortunately, in the UK, I know that if a man sleeps around, he is almost celebrated as a player. But if a woman has more than one sexual partner at a time, she is described as a whore, a slag, a Jezebel. At what point will we drop this almost guerrilla dominance over sexuality? There was very little evidence that Arminda worked as a sex worker apart from her murderer's word. So why is she listed as one of the very many sex workers tragically killed in the UK on Wikipedia? Why does her family have to read that about her? No matter what your opinion, and I hate to say this, if Arminda did in fact marry so that she could escape the limited possibilities she had in her home country by marrying a somewhat financially comfortable man in the UK, why does that mean her life and murder mean less? If you place her actions in 1984 as a form of prostitution, then we must explore the idea that sex work, known as being a mail order bride, as a sort of legally compulsory transactional sex, with, added work. When we consider the issues of men buying sexual access to women, it is essential to recognise that they are deciding to pay so that a woman cannot say no, that the woman in question then becomes property. She is owned. Does that not sound like sexual slavery? John Perry is still incarcerated, thank goodness, because he is a gigantic prick. So after my rant and all the horrible things in this episode, it is time for this week's small act of kindness. It is yet again free to do and makes a massive impact. Just smile. Smile when you go to the shop, smile when you see people on the street, everywhere. Not only will it make somebody else smile, it scientifically makes you happier. And who doesn't want that? Everyone has got something going on in life, and a smile, even from a stranger, can make everything seem just a little bit brighter. So be friendly. Don't wait for the other person to smile first. With that, go be good people, go be kind, go be safe, and most importantly, go be happy.